Let's begin. But first, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the Sky High Stories. The divorce papers had barely dried when he did it. We were standing outside the lawyer's office, the air thick with that awkward silence that follows the end of something once called love. People moved around us, assistants, strangers, a distant relative who had come for support. My heart was still pounding from signing my name away from a marriage I had given years of my life to. That was when he reached into his wallet. He didn't look at me when he handed it over. A sleek card, dark and expensive looking, slid into my palm. "There's 10,000 on it," he said casually, like he was tipping a waiter or donating to a cause. No explanation. No apology. Just that flat, practiced tone. As if this was generosity. As if this was closure. Inside me, something cracked. Humiliation burned first, sharp and sudden. Then anger followed, hot, choking, impossible to voice. Was this what I had been reduced to? A woman to be helped, pitied, written off with a card and a number? I wanted to throw it back at him, to scream that I wasn't his charity case. But disbelief held me still. I stood there, card in hand, stunned by how small he had made me feel in one careless gesture. To everyone else, it looked kind. I could already imagine the whispers, "At least he gave her something. He's not heartless. She'll be fine now." They didn't see what I felt. They didn't hear the insult wrapped in plastic and money. Publicly, it was help. Privately, it was a reminder of power, his over mine. So I did the only thing I could. I smiled. I nodded. I walked away with the card in my bag. But deep inside, I made a quiet promise to myself. I smiled, but I never planned to use it. When our relationship began, it felt simple in the way fairy tales often do. He was charming, confident, and full of plans, and I was drawn to the certainty in his voice when he spoke about the future. We talked about shared dreams late into the night, traveling, building a home filled with laughter, growing old without losing ourselves. I believed him when he said we were a team. I believed love meant walking forward together, even when the path wasn't clear. I gave myself to that belief completely. Slowly, almost without noticing, my life began to reshape itself around his. Opportunities at work were postponed, then quietly abandoned, because his schedule mattered more. "Just for now," he would say. I became the one who adjusted, who waited, who understood. I carried the emotional weight of the marriage, smoothing over conflicts, excusing his silences, convincing myself that love required patience. Compromise became my second language, and sacrifice wore the comforting mask of devotion. There were signs, of course. Small moments I chose not to name. The way he dismissed my concerns with a laugh. The way decisions that affected us both somehow always ended in his favor. If I disagreed, he framed it as me being difficult or ungrateful. I told myself this was normal, that every marriage had its struggles. I ignored the unease in my chest because acknowledging it would have meant questioning everything I had invested in us. Over time, the balance shifted. His success grew, and with it, his authority, over finances, over choices, over the narrative of who we were as a couple. I began asking instead of deciding, explaining instead of asserting. Without realizing it, I had handed him power, trusting he would never misuse it. He liked being needed. I mistook that for love. I leaned on him emotionally, believing security came from dependence, while he grew more comfortable controlling the ground beneath my feet. By the time I noticed how unequal we had become, it felt too late. My confidence had thinned, worn down by years of adapting myself to his world. I had trusted him blindly, convinced that loyalty would protect me. I didn't understand then that love built on imbalance doesn't collapse all at once. It erodes quietly, until one day you look around and realize you no longer recognize the person you became just to keep the peace. The divorce did not unfold with shouting or dramatic confrontations. It was colder than that, efficient, rushed, and stripped of emotion, as if we were dissolving a business contract instead of a marriage. Meetings were scheduled, documents prepared, signatures demanded. There was no space for grief, no acknowledgement of what had been lost. Every step felt mechanical, and I was expected to keep up, to be calm, to be reasonable. When my hands trembled as I signed the papers, no one noticed, or perhaps no one cared. He sat across from me with an air of quiet superiority, composed and untouched. His voice was steady, his posture relaxed, as though this process barely affected him. When I struggled to hold back tears, he avoided my eyes. There was a distance in him that hurt more than anger ever could. It told me he had already moved on emotionally, while I was still trying to understand how we had arrived here. His detachment made me feel small, irrational, weak for feeling so much when he felt so little. Outside the legal rooms, lines were drawn quickly. Some family members stopped calling. Friends I thought would stand by me suddenly grew uncomfortable, offering vague sympathy before drifting away. Others chose his side openly, praising his maturity and fairness. I learned how easily people rewrite history when it makes their lives simpler. As a divorced woman, I became a subject of quiet judgment, watched, analyzed, whispered about. Questions followed me everywhere. What did she do wrong? Why couldn't she make it work? Society had little patience for my pain. I was expected to be grateful it ended peacefully, to appreciate that he was taking care of things. That was why the card hurt more than it helped. It wasn't just money, it was a symbol of how the world saw me now. Not as an equal who had shared years of effort and sacrifice, but as someone to be managed, compensated, and dismissed. Accepting that card felt like accepting the narrative others had written for me, that I had lost, that I needed saving, that my worth could be measured and settled with a number. And yet, even as my spirit felt bruised and exhausted, something inside me refused to break completely. I walked away from the marriage stripped of illusions, judged and misunderstood, but I carried my dignity quietly, even when it was the hardest thing I had left. The days after the divorce were not kind to me. Reality arrived quickly, without warning or mercy. Bills piled up, routines changed, and the security I had once relied on vanished overnight. There were moments when the weight of it all pressed so heavily on my chest that breathing felt difficult. In those moments, the card sat quietly in my bag, a simple solution to very real problems. $10,000 could have eased so much: rent, utilities, groceries, the basic dignity of not having to worry about tomorrow. I won't pretend I never thought about using it. There were nights when I stared at the ceiling, calculating expenses in my head, wondering how long I could stretch what little I had. Once, standing in line at the grocery store, I felt panic rise when my total was higher than expected. Another time, an unexpected expense arrived, urgent and unavoidable, and my hands shook as I searched for options. Each time, the thought surfaced, just use the card. That's what it's there for. But every time I reached that edge, something stopped me. That card was not just money, it carried meaning, and that meaning was heavy. It represented pity disguised as generosity, control wrapped in convenience. Using it would have tied me back to him, confirming the unspoken message that I couldn't survive without his help. It would have turned his final gesture into a lasting hold over my life, a quiet reminder of who had the upper hand. I began to understand that my struggle wasn't only financial, it was about self-respect. I had already lost so much: my marriage, my sense of stability, parts of myself I was still trying to recover. I couldn't lose my dignity too. So I made a silent vow, one I didn't announce to anyone and barely dared to admit to myself. I would survive without his charity, no matter how hard it became. I took the card out of my wallet and placed it somewhere out of sight, tucked away in a drawer with old documents and forgotten objects. Over time, it faded from my daily thoughts, though not from my memory. Physically, it was stored away. Emotionally, I learned to lock it behind resolve. It became a symbol of a line I refused to cross, a reminder that even in my weakest moments, I chose to stand on my own. The years that followed the divorce were quiet in a way that felt both peaceful and painfully empty. Silence filled the spaces where conversation, routine, and shared history used to live. I learned quickly that loneliness after divorce isn't just about being alone, it's about losing the version of yourself that existed inside a marriage. Mornings felt heavier. Evenings stretched too long. There was no one to ask how my day went, no familiar presence to soften the edges of exhaustion. And yet, life did not pause for my grief. Bills still arrived. Work still demanded effort. Survival became my first and most urgent goal. Financially, those early years were unforgiving. I learned how to live smaller, how to count every expense, how to say no to things I once took for granted. There were months when I balanced on the edge, unsure if I was managing well or just barely holding on. I made mistakes, misjudged budgets, trusted the wrong opportunities, overestimated my own strength. Some days ended in quiet tears, not from heartbreak, but from sheer fatigue. Still, I kept going, because stopping was never an option. Progress came in small, almost invisible victories. The first month I paid all my bills on time with money I earned myself felt like a private triumph. The first time I said no to something that didn't serve me, work, people, expectations, I felt a flicker of power return. There were setbacks too. Plans that failed. Confidence that wavered. Moments when doubt whispered that maybe I had made life harder than it needed to be by refusing help. But even those failures taught me something important. I was capable of facing consequences and learning from them. Slowly, independence stopped feeling like punishment and began to feel like freedom. I rebuilt my confidence not through grand achievements, but through consistency. Showing up for myself. Trusting my decisions. Learning skills I had once relied on him for. Each step, no matter how small, added a brick to a foundation I was building on my own. I began to recognize my own resilience, the strength I had underestimated for years. Emotionally, healing did not follow a straight line. Some wounds closed quickly, others reopened without warning. Certain memories still stung, especially when I saw couples who reminded me of what I once believed I had. But over time, the pain softened. Anger gave way to clarity. Grief transformed into acceptance. I stopped defining my worth through what I had lost and started measuring it by what I was becoming. Somewhere along the way, the card slipped into the background of my life. It remained where I had stored it, untouched, gathering dust along with old papers and forgotten reminders of the past. I rarely thought about it, yet its meaning stayed with me. It represented a choice I had made, to endure discomfort rather than surrender my self-respect. The card itself became almost irrelevant, but the lesson it carried did not. In those 7 years of silence, I wasn't just rebuilding my life. I was rebuilding myself, piece by piece, into someone who no longer needed validation, permission, or charity to stand tall. 7 years later, the decision to go to the bank didn't feel dramatic. It wasn't driven by desperation or curiosity, but by practicality. I was organizing old documents, sorting through papers I had carried from place to place since the divorce, when the card fell out of a folder and landed at my feet. For a moment, I just stared at it. It felt like an artifact from another life. I thought it might be expired, deactivated, or completely useless by now. Still, a quiet thought surfaced: I should close this chapter properly. I went to the bank with no expectations. In my mind, the outcome was already decided. The card meant nothing anymore, no value, no power, no relevance. I imagined the banker taking one look at it, shaking their head, and handing it back with a polite apology. Maybe it would even feel satisfying, proof that the final thread connecting me to my past had long since dissolved. I told myself I was there for closure, nothing more. The bank was busy that day, filled with the low hum of conversations and the steady rhythm of numbers being called. When my turn came, I stepped up to the counter and slid the card across without ceremony. "I'd like to check this account," I said calmly. The banker typed something into the system, expression neutral at first. Then, slowly, their demeanor changed. Their fingers paused above the keyboard. Their eyes narrowed slightly at the screen. Then they looked up at me, not casually, but with focus, as if reassessing who I was. Something about that shift made my stomach tighten. I told myself it was nothing, that I was reading too much into a routine interaction. But the silence stretched longer than it should have, heavy and uncomfortable. The banker excused themselves briefly and returned with someone else. Now there were two of them looking at the screen, exchanging glances I couldn't interpret. My pulse quickened. I felt exposed, standing there while strangers seemed to know something about me that I didn't. The ordinary sounds of the bank faded into the background as tension settled in my chest. Finally, the banker leaned forward slightly, lowering their voice. There was a note of careful seriousness in their tone that I hadn't heard before. They said, "Are you aware of what this card is linked to?" In that moment, the past I thought I had buried stirred awake, and I realized that this visit, this ordinary, forgettable errand, was about to change everything I believed I knew. The banker turned the screen slightly toward me, though most of the numbers meant nothing at first glance. There were more digits than I expected, lines of information I didn't recognize, dates that stretched back years. Sensing my confusion, they began to explain carefully, choosing each word with precision. The account linked to the card wasn't a simple prepaid amount, nor was it an ordinary checking account. It was an investment-linked account, structured to grow over time, untouched and compounding as long as no withdrawals were made. As the details unfolded, my breath caught. What I had once believed to be a fixed $10,000 had multiplied quietly over the years. Interest, reinvestments, and conditions written deep into the account agreement had transformed it into something far greater than its original value. The banker explained that the account had been set up with specific terms that only applied if the funds remained unused. By not touching the card, I had unknowingly fulfilled those conditions. What struck me hardest was the realization that my ex had never expected this outcome. He had assumed I would use the money quickly, that necessity would override pride. The structure of the account made that assumption clear. It was designed to benefit impatience, not restraint. He believed he understood my limits, my breaking point. In that moment, it became painfully obvious how wrong he had been. The way the banker spoke to me changed completely. Their voice softened, respectful now, and they addressed me with a formality that hadn't been there before. Questions were asked differently. Explanations were thorough, careful, as if I was someone whose time and understanding mattered. I felt the shift acutely. The same world that once saw me as a woman in need now regarded me as someone of significance. Emotions surged through me, layered and complex. I remembered standing outside the lawyer's office, card in hand, feeling humiliated and small. That memory clashed sharply with the present moment, where I stood steady, informed, and unexpectedly powerful. Nothing about me had changed in appearance, yet everything about how I was perceived had. As the banker finished explaining, clarity settled in. The greatest strength I had shown over those 7 years wasn't endurance or sacrifice alone, it was silence. By refusing to react, to spend, to prove anything to anyone, I had protected more than money. I had protected my autonomy. In doing so, I had turned what was meant to be an insult into a quiet victory, one my ex never imagined I would achieve. I didn't call him. I didn't feel the need to announce what I had discovered or to watch his expression change as the truth settled in. That chapter of my life no longer required an audience. The power I felt didn't come from proving him wrong, it came from knowing I didn't need his acknowledgement anymore. I gathered my documents, thanked the banker, and walked out of the building with steady steps. The world outside looked the same as it always had, yet I moved through it differently. The weight I had carried for years felt lighter, as if something unseen had finally loosened its grip. There was no anger left to fuel me, no desire for revenge. Only clarity. I had survived without his charity, rebuilt myself in silence, and arrived at this moment on my own terms. As I stepped into the sunlight, I understood something deeply and finally. Strength doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes, it simply walks away, whole, unbowed, and free.